I'm Kevin Jacobsen of Gold Derby here with Arthur Max, the production designer behind The Last Duel. And I want to just start with asking what your familiarity was with all the different areas that you filmed in France before jumping into all the research for the film.
Well, I mean, previously I'd been to Paris a couple of times, but not for a very long time. And I'd been to the south of France a couple of times, the Cannes Film Festival once or twice, Nice, and on an early holiday. That was back in the 70s. So I hadn't really done a lot of work in France. I did have some experience doing ballet design in 1973. That was probably the only time I actually worked there previously. And so it was very exciting. And I got together with a location manager named Jerome Bouzier, and he and I jumped in the car and on trains and in minivans and toured most of France. And I have to say, it was an extraordinary scout, going originally to Normandy, where the film is historically set, and finding that Normandy had been quite well commercially developed, both agriculturally and in terms of urban development. So it really wasn't what we wanted for the 14th century. So we went further afield. We worked our way south down into the Dordogne, where Ridley had made his first film, The Duelist. Seemed appropriate, seemed a good idea. And it was, because we ended up doing a big chunk of work there, particularly around the town of Sarlat and various chateaus in that region, the Périgord, as it's known generally. And we had Chateau Benac, we had Chateau de Fenelon, and we had also further south in Provence from there, the monastery of Fontfroide, which was a deconsecrated monastery, which was great for us because we could do anything we wanted in regard to setting the scenes in the church itself without restrictions. It became a business center over time and an events venue. So that worked very well. And we had our royal court there. We had a baptism there. We did quite a few scenes in that complex in the gardens. We had a couple of scenes. And in Benac, we had some mixed interiors between scenes that were supposed to be in the Chateau de Carouge. The Jean Carouge wedding celebration was there. The Great Hall of his chateau was there. Then there was also on the rooftop overlooking the entire river valley, was allegedly the headquarters of Pierre d'Alençon, the Ben Affleck character, where there was, after a night of heavy debauchery, let's say, Jacques Legris and Pierre sort of have the morning after conversation on the rooftop overlooking the superb river valley. And so also in that chateau, Chateau Benac, there was the original bedroom of Richard the Lionheart. Richard I of England stayed there. And so we didn't shoot in there. It was quite small, but we copied it and enlarged it and made it into a set in Ireland at Ardmore Studios as Jean de Carouge's bedroom. And we did an enormous amount of detail surveying, virtually stone by stone. We molded the floorboards because the floorboards were hand cut and hand finished. So we wanted all those textures, apart from the architectural detail. And we kind of emulated as much as possible every aspect of that room for because we had critical scenes in that bedroom where the various rape scenes take place. So it was quite important room for us. We also went further afield, more to the east and central France, for the exterior of Chateau de Carouge, which was a place called Chateau Berzay-le-Châtel in Burgundy, which was in a magnificent valley setting on top of a promontory overlooking an enormous valley surrounded by farmlands and hills, and which was epic vistas, or in 360. It had its own chapel. It had its original entry gate, and it was really 12th century and very unspoiled. Unfortunately, it didn't have any interiors to speak of.
Mhm.
So we had to split that with Chateau Benac. The other chateau I mentioned, Chateau Fenelon, was used as the fortress command center of Carouge's father, where we staged the funeral. Once Carouge Sr. passed away, Jean Carouge expected to inherit the title, which was a very important military command in the area of Normandy that he occupied, but was gazumped by Jacques Legris, the Adam Driver character, through his association with Ben Affleck's character, Pierre, who was the Duke and cousin of the king and had enormous power to interfere in the normal course of things Carouge would have inherited, but in this case. And that drove, a wedge between the two characters. And that was the beginning of the downward spiral toward the duel to the death, which we did in Ireland, moving away from France to Ardmore Studios. Now, the reason we went to Ireland was to find the unspoiled landscapes that we were struggling to find in France, which was much more developed with commercial farmlands. What we wanted were the medieval patterns of fields divided by hedgerows into small parcels, which was typical of medieval France and was also very easily found in Ireland, particularly around Wicklow, not far from Dublin. And combined with the fact that there was a very good film studio at Ardmore in Bray, that package was irresistible. So we ended up building our jousting arena about half an hour away from the studio, and several stage sets, including Pierre d'Alençon's Great Hall, which we revamped several times for several different rooms in his chateau. We also had another stage which contained his bedroom, and also, as I mentioned, yet another set which was Carouge's bedroom. So that all worked out very well.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like a very complex production, and I'm curious because you had to shut down at a certain point. What was happening in between when you were able to start up again, and how did that sort of influence your thinking for the film itself?
Well, I mean, I got to go home for the first time in several years during the spring season, which I hadn't seen for a very long time. So I was quite content, tending my garden in Los Angeles and thinking about, how to approach the coming, completion of what was to be about 50% of the film. Whereas the day that we shut down was the day that the French unit was due to arrive. So it was probably the greatest anticlimax in the history of filmmaking when we were told they're not coming. And we were very disconsolate about that. But that was before we realized the reason. And this was very early on in the COVID pandemic period. And we were told to carry on working and that they would figure out, what the new schedule would be. That lasted 24 hours. The next day, we were told to go home. And in my case, they said, you better hurry because the last plane that's going to be allowed into the United States from Ireland is about to leave. And we've booked you on it. So I headed for the airport in a
Yeah.
big hurry. But what it did was it allowed us time when we restarted to really, we were ready to shoot, but we hadn't really had the time, to do the kind of nuancing that we like to do with sets. So, when we came back, we got to actually finish up and detail some of the finer points of each set that we hadn't quite completed. The process was, in a way, beneficial because we all recharged our batteries and came back with, clear heads and a lot more energy than we would have had we gone straight into the Irish shoot. So it was a positive in many ways.
I'm also curious, just in terms of the visual look of the film, what your collaboration was with Dariusz Wolski, who was the cinematographer, especially for the interior scenes where it's all just lit by candlelight, which doesn't really have the same effect as a natural light. Like, what were your discussions there?
Well, yes, you mentioned Darius, who's sometimes known as the Prince of Darkness, and the world that we were in is full of flickering fire in the fireplaces, candle light from various kinds of sources, which we went through with him in a testing period before we started shooting, and offered up both practical candles of various sizes, double and triple wick, depending on the available light, depending on the room, depending on what kind of windows were available, and also LED candles where we weren't able, for reasons of fire restriction, or ventilation was also an issue. We built half a dozen fireplaces for the movie, both in France and in Ireland, and we always used them as key lights. So we had big roaring fires, which was a challenge in itself. Practical insulation was an issue, safety factors on stage and also within the various locations that we used. But the color palette was important because when you're using flame, everything tends to go very warm and orangey. And so to counteract that, we stayed away from warm colors and tried to be very cold in terms of tonalities, so that when the firelight was used, it wouldn't look too rich and vivid. So there was a few tests that we did for paint finishes that Darius photographed to settle on shades of gray, leaning towards the cooler tones generally. And there's a close collaboration between Darius and myself, and we've done a number of films. I first met him in the 1980s on a commercial with Tony Scott, and so I've known him for quite a long time. And we both come from the same sort of school of visual stylists that come out of advertising directors, both Ridley, and I've also worked with David Fincher a couple of times. And that school, also, Darius comes from advertising too in the beginning. So we had a lot in common, and there was a common language, visual language. We communicated very well on a lot of levels.
Well, speaking of that collaboration there, as obviously from looking at your filmography, you've enjoyed a very long and fruitful collaboration with Ridley Scott, starting with, I think, G.I. Jane back in the 90s. What kind of shorthand do you have now with Ridley at this point, having worked with him for so long and also in so many different genres that you might not have with another director?
Well, I mean, with Ridley, it's always a learning experience. It still is, and he teaches a visual vocabulary to everyone he works with. I've learned it very well through a lot of genres, and what's common to all the different genres, he's a genre buster. I mean, he always tries to do something fresh within each genre, whether it's past, present, or future subject matter, is to use shape language almost as an element of character. In terms of what I mean by that is silhouettes are very important, shadow and light in relation to those objects. He uses people as objects very often. It's a kind of a visual language that I think, whether we realize it or not, all of us who love filmmaking have been affected by and still are. And I think he's had a very important influence on all of us that, not only in the art department, but in every department, in the way that he approaches making films from the very first to the current day. And I'm still learning.
Well, I mean, since I have you here, we are an awards website. You are a 3-time Oscar nominee. You've been nominated for Gladiator and American Gangster and The Martian. Again, 3 very different films with wildly different settings. I'm just curious, in these last minute or two here, when you look back, is there one of those films that really just stands out to you, either for how challenging it was or how fun it was, where it just felt good that you were acknowledged for it?
Well, I'd have to split the decision between Gladiator, which was, being really thrown into the deep end, having only done 1 or 2 films, which were much smaller in scale previously, and not Ancient World. Both of them were fairly contemporary films, being Seven and G.I. Jane, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. But Gladiator was, the first of many epics to come. And then the other, on a very much more personal level, was American Gangster, which was a film set in New York, in a neighborhood where I spent some time as a child with my grandmother in the neighborhood of East Harlem. And so I knew very well, we actually shot a couple of scenes on my grandmother's block. And that was very rewarding. And, it was some place I knew quite well. And the story was set at a time that I was actually in New York and living through the ambience of New York in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, which, I knew firsthand. So that was, on a personal level, very gratifying. And not to leave The Martian out. The Martian was probably the most challenging technically of all.
Can imagine.
Because of its industrial design emphasis and the precision that it required, the reality of, the sets and the prop making. Things actually had to work and had to be, obeying the laws of the physical universe in camera. So that was quite, so they're all 3 of them. I can't really separate them too much.
Nice.
For various reasons.
They're all your babies. Yeah.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for those of you watching, subscribe for more interviews and go to goldderby.com to make your Oscar predictions. Arthur, thanks so much for your time today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.